The question here is whether God is a consociate in Alfred Schutz's sense of the term, whether it's just a subjective fantasy or objective givenness. I want to just start with a few preliminary comments. In my book that Olga just mentioned, I talk about religious experience as a symbolic, particularly involved with symbolic appresentation within a Schutzian finite province of meaning. But I've changed a bit from that. Appresentation is where things sort of appresent something else. It's a Husserlian term, so appresent other kinds of realities. But Anthony Steinbach, in a lot of his work, some of his work recently on mysticism, talks about the vertical, which involves the interpersonal involvement with God, as prominent in the Abrahamic religions. And he says it's a neglected topic in phenomenological and philosophical accounts. So I want to add and preface this by saying the holy need not be experienced as personal, though, and this is to grant that there's certainly experiences of holy in lots of other religious frameworks. There's a quote that Flannery O'Connor makes in conversations with Mary McCarthy, who was an author, who said that she was moved from experience of the Holy Ghost in childhood as a person to seeing that as a pretty good symbol, to which Flannery O'Connor responded, well, if it's a symbol, the hell with it. And so the parts of this paper then will deal with, so we want to see it as sort of perhaps an interpersonal kind of connection here. First of all, I want to talk about the experience of God using Steinbach's kind of background. I mean, Steinbach's done this whole study of what mysticism's like, and so I'm going to use that as a starting point. And there I'm going to try to show that the experience of God is one of a consociate and not a contemporary. And yet this will undo Schutz's structure of the social world, since consociates need bodily presence. And that makes you wonder whether this is just a subjective fantasy. We're running against the very structure of the social world that Schutz lays out, or objective, given the stubbornness of consociate experience, which I'll talk about. I'm also going to make a quick comparison with William Alston, some analytic philosophers, William Alston's Perceiving God, and Alvin Plantinga's discussion of basic beliefs, which depend on a kind of phenomenological experience that allows for ascending levels of justification, including what Alston calls socially established doxastic practices, which I want to dwell on a bit. And I think that's compatible with Schutz's account of finite provinces of meaning, in particular, religious experience and theoretical contemplation. Science is in the theoretical contemplation area, and that's where justification issues come up, philosophy too. And finally, I will talk about different kinds of realities established by resistance, according to Max Scheler. More fittingly, I think this fits with the experience of consociates, with a consociate who intervenes in one's experience and actually then does resist one. That's what I want to kind of talk about. So Scheler and Schutz then, I think, actually reflect different sides, with Scheler taking up sort of the noetic side and Schutz the noetic side of a phenomenological account. Okay, so religious experience as an encounter with a consociate. Steinbach, Merton, and other mystic texts show that religious experience in the Abrahamic traditions as an interpersonal exchange with God. They involve unexpected intervention, God playing a personal role as friend, lover, parent, interrupts one's patterns of anxiety, self-focus, for instance, and other patterns. And God is then experienced as intervening, correcting, surprising, inviting, resisting, and even avoiding compulsive entrapments that we might want to bring God into. So this is Steinbach's discussion of mystical experience. So then the question is, relying on Schutz's structure of the social world, can one interpret mystical writings as indicating that God is experienced as a consociate and not a contemporary? Features of the consociate relationship, two consociates, like we have one right now, we share space and time. One adopts a thou orientation to the other, as Schutz calls it. The other's experiences unfold before one. One participates in ongoing experience. The other's reactions are temporally coordinated with one's own. One's knowledge of the other increases through continuous revision. The understanding of each other is constantly being corrected, expanded, and enriched. Now, what's the contemporary relationship? The contemporary is when you walk out this room, you would suddenly become a contemporary. And at that point, we have shared time, but not shared space. Both partners then adopt a they orientation. One thinks about the other, each inferentially and discursively constructs types, a predicative rather than pre-predicative experience, and the consociate experience is pre-predicative. One replaces the subjective meaning context of the other with an objective meaning context, one's own. The subjective experience of the other is replaced with one's own. One draws on a variety of sources, the testimony of others who have seen a distant contemporary, memories, fleeting evidence of an email, a letter, or a photo. I construct what's going on in the contemporary's consciousness. Schutz says one lifts a living experience of the other out of its setting and produces a frozen, hard and fast ideal type, a type always determined from the interpreter's point of view. In addition, there's much diminished correction possibilities in contemporary relationships. One engages a shadow person, Schutz says, has a type for a partner, not a real person. Our contemporaries are given as not aware of each other's ongoing flow. There are no empty pretensions with my contemporary in the other. The other lacks duration and the unpredictable freedom of a consociate. That's not given in the contemporary. When you walk out that door, I no longer have this unpredictable freedom. I no longer have these empty pretensions that are sort of waiting to be fulfilled as I watch you speak before me, for instance. Schutz wonders if the contemporary even has a stream of consciousness at all. And interaction also between consociates and contemporaries. Consociates are experienced as interlocking as opposed to contemporaries who are mutually relating. Imagination and inference with regard to contemporaries becomes more prominent as opposed to an immediate engagement and confrontation which one has with consociates. Knowledge of contemporary is a matter of conjecture, probability. Any effort to influence or contact one's contemporary may fall short of the mark. But this is paradoxical, because ordinarily for Schutz, consociates share the same space, bodily proximity. But God has no body, or at least is not usually experienced as having one, and the way one experiences contemporaries who are not bodily presence does not fit with the mystical experience of God in which God is experienced as being present, described by Steinbach as engaging, moving, alluring, or pressing one to see things differently. In fact, according to Shaler and Steinbach, the mystic is the recipient of God's action and initiative, and does not, therefore, replace God's subjective meaning context with the mystic's objective ones. So on the one hand, what mystical experience seems to run counter to the whole structure of the social world that Schutz talks about. This might lead one then to argue that mystical experience violates the stubborn structures of the social world of everyday life, and a proof that it's merely a matter of fantasy. Or God is so experienced as an independent consociate intervening in the mystic stream of experience that this kind of experience has such staying powers, also across generations of the Abrahamic religions, that it does not seem to be merely a matter of fantasy. So it's staying power across these generations of these religions, and also the experience itself of being resisted in a consociate relationship makes it possibly seem like this isn't just subjective fantasy. Okay, at this point, that's sort of what I've showed there is that Schutz can amplify what Steinbach talks about as mystical experiences. Now I'd like to talk about William Alston and Alvin Plantinga a little on religious experience and justification. Alston, first of all, Alston describes the experience of God as what he calls non-sensual perception, being acted upon as one is in perception. One is acted upon in the way that one is in the experience of perception, but it's not sensual in character. One can immediately be justified in perception, he says, as when the purple look of the flower seems to render one justified in believing the flower to be purple. And it can be prima facie justified unless there's an overrider present, such as a purple light in the greenhouse. Perception elicits belief, but in experience, one may not even be thinking about the belief itself or its justifiability. When one's perceiving, one's just engaged in the perceiving. Someone, another, or oneself at a later reflective moment can assess the adequacy of the belief in an objective sense. When we're trying to assess something objectively, we're trying to see is this adequate or not, in order to have justification. One may be justified in perceptual belief without being able to provide a higher level justification for it oneself. Someone else can justify it. And then Alston also sees justification as pertaining to more comprehensive contexts, what he calls doxastic practices, for perception and for religious experience. One may not be able to prove the reliability of perceptual beliefs, and there's a whole analytic discussion about reliability here, but we can show it's rational to hold such belief through doxastic practices. These are systems of dispositions and habits socially developed and reinforced, yielding outcomes on the basis of inputs. And it is rational to rely on these practices if the total output does not yield unreliable results. These practices are socially established, and we absorb them long before we reflect on them. Okay, and Alston also argues that one need not feel compelled to abandon these practices because not all normal adults engage in them or find them plausible. And also, so you're more working within a doxastic community here. Alston also rounds out his discussion by arguing that there's a pluralism of spheres of reality and correlative doxastic practices. one ought not judge mystical practices by the standards used in the practices of sense perception. That would form, as he calls it, that would be a form of epistemic imperialism. Mystical practices do not take religious experience for self-authenticating, since doxastic practices have developed a battery of tests to differentiate spurious from authentic experience, as Steinbach too suggests. There are critical mechanisms at work within doxastic practices evaluating mystical experiences. There's an impossibility to find and Alston also adds there's an impossibility to find a standard. This is when he comes into dealing with alternative religious frameworks. It's impossible to find a standard apart from some religious tradition to assess other traditions. It's very difficult to do that, he says. So in those cases, it may be that the only rational course for me is to sit tight with the practice of which I'm a master and which serves me so well in guiding my activity in the world, not impugning necessarily the truth or the validity of this other religious tradition. Plantinga, too, tries to argue about, actually, it's interesting, both of them start with the notion of religious experience and then move to levels of justification. And I think those basic levels are very much like phenomenological kinds of experience. The basic beliefs for Plantinga are accepted without being accepted on the basis of other propositions, like perceptual beliefs. And he gives an example: upon perception of the night sky, belief in God arises, but not as a conclusion from premises. And he, too, has levels of justification. There's a deontological one where one can hold on to a belief if one has exercised responsible examination and still finds oneself within one's intellectual rights to still believe. But he says an insane person might do this also, and so he talks rather about a higher level of justification that involves what he calls warranted basic beliefs, produced by cognitive faculties functioning properly in a congenial environment according to a design plan successfully aimed at truth. That's Plantinga's definition. Diverse cultural backgrounds or studies based on scientific procedures like historical biblical criticism need not dissuade one from one's own belief. Here's Plantinga. One need not abandon one's belief because one cannot arrive at consensus with others, and it is possible that one might operate within different doxastic practices with different ultimate presuppositions. For instance, the discussion between religious belief and historical biblical criticism. So, in conclusion, both Alston and Plantinga allow for basic beliefs based on religious experiences that I think Alston several times talks about the phenomenological character of these experiences. By the way, someone pointed out to me, Alston did translate into English Husserl's the idea of phenomenology, so he's well acquainted with Husserl's work. And so they can be phenomenologically described, and then we entertain the possibility of ascending levels of justification with diverse justificatory strategies. Okay, so first part of the paper talked basically about using Schutz's distinction between contemporary and consociates to amplify on what Steinbach calls the mystical experience. Second part kind of took a little detour to look at Alston and Plantinga, and now I'm coming back to the religious experience of God as a consociate, and conclude the paper by talking about intersubjectivity, justification, and reality. Adam Green argues against Alston. He says the experience of God, this whole idea of a non-perceptual experience, he says, what are the phenomenal qualities of the divine phenomena? And the complexity of the experience of God exceeds the perceptual. And so he turns instead to what he calls intersubjective perception based on shared attention. But while intersubjectivity is a better model, and I agree with Green on that, Green neglects Alston's view that one is acted upon by God, and shared attention modeled on baby cooperation with one's parent, for instance, misses the kind of experience of the intervention of the consociate, which is more forceful, which offsets the subjectivization of religious experience and fits more with Schutz's account of religious experience as occurring in a province of meaning, with a more relaxed tension of consciousness. What I've argued is that Schutz's view of the finite province of religious experience has a more relaxed experience of consciousness, and so when you give more power to this consociate acting on you, it fits with the passivity that is more characteristic of the religious province of meaning, and which passivity is more prominent. Schutz's other examples of passive finite provinces of meaning, for instance, are fantasy and dreaming, which you can see there's greater passivity at work there than in everyday life. Shaler, too, access to the religious realm is through the religious act, which contrasts with, he says, spontaneous cognitive acts and being receptive to God's action, and fits more with the personal character of God. As Shaler says, if God is in some way personal, it is of the very essence of God that the peculiarly, that's misspelled, excuse me. the peculiar person sector of him can never evidently be brought to our knowledge by our own spontaneous cognitive acts. On the contrary, if such knowledge is to come into being at all, it must originate in God with his free and sovereign condescension to us. It must begin with some act where he discloses and imparts himself to us, reveals himself as a person. We have a name for this kind of communication, revelation. We therefore know that a personal God, if he exists, and in respect of his personality, can only be known through revelation or grace or illumination. So Shaler also emphasizes this personal kind of relationship, also sees it as involving this kind of passive receptivity, fitting with a finite province of meaning religious experience that I think would be Schutz's view. Oh, it's not Schutz's view, it's my view. I worked that out in my book on Schutz's finite provinces of meaning. Steinbach, too, in the Abrahamic religious experience, talks about the epiphany of God is not produced by making the experience of God happen through some kind of technique. And I should add that Steinbach works through Teresa of Avila, Rabbi Dor Bayer, for the Jewish Abrahamic position, and Riz bin Bakel in the Islamic tradition, too. So these are all traditions within this Abrahamic framework. And he's talking about this epiphany. But in epiphany, he says, being leaves the realm of impersonal reasoning and becomes radically personal. So Shaler and Steinbach versus Alston and his idea of non-perceptual experience really emphasize the interpersonal relationship. But I want an interpersonal relationship that emphasizes experience of being acted on versus Green's view of shared attention. With the baby and shared attention, it's more like the baby sees the parent looking in a direction and looks. But there is a kind of intervention there, it seems to me, at least when the baby recognizes there's another consciousness looking. There's a kind of intervention, but it's not like the kind of experience that Schutz describes with Consociates, where there's a real interplay between me and the other. Okay, and these views, I argue, converge with a Schutzian approach based on the experience of Consociate. Okay, justification. So that's intersubjectivity, which I want to argue as part of this mystical experience. Justification. I think Schutz's theoretical province of meaning can accommodate the kinds of justification, levels of justification that Alston and Plantinga propose. One regularly assesses beliefs almost immediately, insofar as, according to Schutz, my mind may pass during one single day or even 1 hour through the whole gamut of tensions of consciousness, now living in working acts, now passing through a daydream, now plunging into the pictorial world of painting, now indulging in theoretical contemplation. So even in the very moment, I become reflective, and almost theoretic calls that a theoretical enclave. So I'm constantly sort of evaluating my own experiences as I move in and out of levels of reflection. Well, higher level socially established doxastic practices would fit well with this social dimension of the theoretical province of meaning in Schutz's view, where you see doxastic practices. Schutz really talks in the religious finite province of meaning that I've argued. There's a distinct type of sociality. I could talk more about that if people are interested. But part of that would also involve social relationships within the finite province of meaning of religion that would involve justification. And actually, I suspect that would be a kind of enclave. Enclave is a relationship between the theoretical province and the religious. Within the religious sphere, there are these little theoretical enclaves. Anselm's ontological argument is that, for example. I mean, it's a prayer. Anselm's ontological argument is a prayer in which he gives the ontological argument, right? So it's a theoretical enclave, right? It's a fusing of religious and theoretical activity. And that can happen with these doxastic practices, I think. So finally, we get to the question of reality, the best for last. Alston's and Plantinga's discussions of epistemic imperialism, where the standards of sense perception are applied to all other areas, and different ultimate presuppositions of different doxastic practices, actually refer, I think, to the underlying question of reality. Here's where the analytic philosophers don't bring that up so much, but it seems to me we are talking about different kinds of reality. For Schutz, there are multiple realities, and I've tried to use this to apply it to the religious sphere, which depend on an as particular epoche, a tension of consciousness, a form of spontaneity, experience of self, sociality, and temporality. And Schutz says within any province, one confers the accent of reality on what one experiences within these provinces. I think he provides, therefore, a more comprehensive approach than either Alston or Plantinga to what the question of reality would be. Similarly, Shaler, realities are regions of being nature, the inner world, outer world, realm of the absolute, social world, which pre-exists conscious activity and priority relations. He says the you relationship is before the inner or outer world, and it therefore undermines idealistic constructions of the other. So if you go to the outer world or inner world first, you could get the you to end up the relationship with the other as sort of an idealistic construction. But the you takes precedence over those worlds. Reality is given as resistant, in Shaler's view, to one's upsurging conative spontaneity. So the experience of reality precedes and evokes reflection. Such experience is not limited to sensation. It occurs in memory. We get resistance in memory. Dilthey talks about using a stick to feel the resistant wall through touch sensations. And so the experience is taken to be in by a central layer of the self rather than on the sensory periphery. So the experience of reality for Shaler is more profound than sense experience in a way. It's a resistance that one experiences. So then I could just think about Schutz and Shaler here. So the experience of resistance of the Consociate, which I talked about in the beginning, indicates its reality in everyday life, and I think in the sphere of religious reality, where there's a resistance within the religious sphere from this other person. Aaron Gurvich, in an argument with Schutz, emphasized order of existence versus Schutz's more noetic approach to reality, and I think Shaler then is on Gurvich's side. That's what I want to argue. He's got a more noematic approach. Misspelled Gurvich there, sorry. So Shaler's account may actually converge better with the passivity and dependence on God's initiative and action, according to the mystics, insofar as he's got a noematic approach, where there's this other reality there before I think about it and acting on me. And I would say even the religious epoche, which I described, like for instance the entrance into the religious province, can be passively evoked. For instance, when I enter into a temple or a synagogue, then all of a sudden, for the religious epoche is initiated, where I'm suddenly removed from the world of everyday life. I enter into a different realm. It's like the phenomenological epoche, but that's passively evoked by the reality, right? And so the very entrance into the religious sphere may fit more with what Shaler's saying, that reality sort of acts on me, and therefore the very initiative in entrance into the religious sphere, which for Schutz tends to be much more noetically determined, may better explain what's kind of at the origin here. But I think it would be advisable to include both noetic and noematic dimensions of the religious experience. I think Shaler and Schutz could work together with a kind of joint approach here. And so conclusion, might the touchstone of the reality, this is just a further question of one's interlocutor, even as a consociate, be not the other's sensible givenness, but one's experience of the resistance of the other? That would be an interesting question. That's it. Thank you.